So I'm Pam Palmater. I'm from Eel River Bar First Nation in northern New Brunswick. I come from Mi'kmaq territory and I'm a citizen of the Mi'kmaq Nation. I'm also a lawyer and I'm a professor and I'm the chair in Indigenous Governance at Ryerson University.
Okay. And today you want to talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. So maybe the first question would be, why is there this problem?
Well, that's probably the most important question anybody could ask, because there's a lot of rhetoric and there's a lot of misinformation in the media. This issue around murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls didn't just crop up a couple of years ago when it got all of the media attention. This has actually been a problem since contact. The very first documented cases of murdered and missing Indigenous women started in 1749 when Governor Cornwallis enacted scalping bounties against Mi'kmaq women and children and Mi'kmaq men. So 10 guineas were paid for their murder for the express purpose to decimate our populations. And some people might think that's a really extreme example, but the law never changed. Because after that came smallpox blankets, and after that came a forced sterilization of Indigenous women across the country, and after that came the theft of their children in schools where lots of little girls were murdered, raped, and tortured. And so this pattern of violence against Indigenous women by state actors has been in place for so long that it seems to have become the norm, that it's something that we don't even see anymore unless the media makes a big deal about it. And so you have this scenario where the law has not only created violence against Indigenous women, but it maintains it both in specific laws like the Indian Act, where Indigenous women and their children lose their status and lose their homes and don't have access to fundamental human services like housing and water, but also in the violation of law, this situation is maintained. So the failure to abide by human rights laws, the failure to abide by treaties, the failure to abide by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, all of these gross violations of our own laws here in Canada maintain this situation. And so we have a scenario where people are asking, what are the root causes of this? And the root causes are laws that are currently on the books. Those scalping laws are still on the books. Somehow it's okay to celebrate people like Governor Cornwallis and name schools after them, despite the fact that they murdered our Indigenous women and girls. So we have a big problem in Canada in terms of how do we educate Canadians on all of those uncomfortable truths about why we have this problem? Because the current discourse is really a campaign of misinformation.
Okay. Yeah, that I was going to say some of the discourse when you're looking at root causes might be saying there's poverty and there's land dispossession and there's sexism and racism and those kind of things saying it's root cause, but you kind of complemented that. But so what do you think of you mentioned the discourse in the media around this issue and different people saying different things. So what do you think is important for an analysis of that discourse?
Well, look at how we're even talking about the problem. You have an RCMP report that says 1,181 murdered or missing Indigenous women, as if this number is anywhere near accurate. If you total the thousands murdered in residential schools and by scalping laws and smallpox blankets and deaths in police custody and in child care and all of these scenarios, the number far supersedes that. But we're looking at the perpetrators as the source of our information, as the source of, they're going to give us the analysis. So the RCMP says, look, the issue is really, these women, they tend to be involved in criminality and they tend to have problems with intoxication. And you have Prime Minister Harper saying there's no sociological phenomena here. This is a situation of crime. And then you have Minister Valcourt, of course, saying we don't need an inquiry, we know what the problem is. Those First Nation men have no respect for women. So what kind of messaging is that giving to Canadians? Well, it's really a bunch of criminals doing criminal acts against one another, and so really they're to blame. There's nothing that we as Canadians can do. These people just have to stop doing what it is that they're doing. And the Canadian state is right when it says, here's what the possible solutions are. If the problem is that it's crime, then let's just throw a whole bunch more money at the police. But they never give Canadians enough information to say, hey, wait a minute, is part of the problem perhaps the police in and of themselves? We got a little bit of a glimpse into that in BC in terms of the Robert Pickton inquiry and the utter failure of the RCMP to follow up and investigate leads of murdered and missing Indigenous women. But what we didn't hear in the media were the reports by the Human Rights Watch, which were saying, hey, it's not just that they're not investigating these scenarios, it's that they, the RCMP, are the actual perpetrators of the rapes, murders, and violence against Indigenous women and girls in BC. That's a huge issue. Or the fact that we had a sitting provincial court justice, David Ramsey, plead guilty to sexual assault causing bodily harm to 12 to 17-year-old Indigenous little girls. That it's not just the RCMP, it's not just the criminal justice system that's failing in some kind of benign neglect, that these state actors are actually perpetrating the violence themselves. And of course the most recent example of that is Constable Terrio from Ontario, who, as a police officer, arrested an intoxicated Aboriginal woman, took her out of her cell to have relations with her. You can't imagine any more abuse of power than that. So if Canadians aren't given the information about the really uncomfortable truths and all of the problems which a national inquiry would help bring to light, then we have no way by which to do any kind of analysis of what the proposed solutions are. So Harper says it's crime, give more money to the police. Seems to make sense if your rhetoric is we're just a bunch of criminals. But if you have access to all their information and know that we have chronically maintained and legislated poverty by the federal government, which makes these women more vulnerable, which makes them homeless. And if you look at the statistics which show they're not going murdered or missing from their home communities. The vast majority of them are going murdered or missing in large urban areas where everybody else lives. So what's the problem then? And I think that this discourse around it and how we talk about it in terms of criminality, or that it must have been the victim's fault, and this kind of othering of Indigenous peoples really separates us from potential allies in Canadian society, where if they had the actual facts, they could throw away the rhetoric and say, okay, well, maybe a national inquiry is far more useful, not just for First Nations, but for Canadians as well, just to be educated on the facts, to kind of get away from this propaganda.
So talking about a national inquiry, or a call for a national inquiry, you mentioned the Pickton inquiry and or the case, and there's the inquiry, and there are a lot of problems with that. And I think some people are kind of against an inquiry based on that, or have qualms about demanding an inquiry. So I was wondering, what do you think is important in the call for an inquiry?
I think the most important thing in this call for an inquiry is that it has been almost unanimous, not just by the families of the murdered and missing Indigenous women, girls, and all of the First Nation and women's rights groups and organizations, but also by the majority of the provinces and territories, by all of the international human rights committees that have ever looked at the issue, by legal experts. There's a reason why everyone is calling for a broad, expansive national inquiry, and it's because we have to know all the things we don't know. If we know about one judge sexually assaulting Indigenous girls and a few police officers raping and murdering Aboriginal girls, then what don't we know? Because those are the things that we only find out by accident. And I think there's a lot to be learned from the Pickton inquiry. Here's how not to do it. That was the worst mess you could possibly have for an inquiry, but it was totally predictable. If you don't provide supports and fundings for the people who have to appear before the inquiry, if you don't set it out with an expansive scope, if you appoint a commissioner who previously was the Attorney General in BC and denied the claims of Indigenous women who are forcibly sterilized, you're setting yourself up for failure. And this wasn't done in conjunction with Indigenous peoples. So I think a national inquiry, expansive in scope, with very targeted investigatory powers, done in partnership with those impacted and First Nations, for example, at the same time with an emergency action plan to protect Indigenous women and girls right now, in terms of not just their personal safety, but also in terms of their mental health, their social well-being. All of those things need to be addressed. All of the chronic underfunding for housing and education and water and sanitation and food, all of these things pose a threat to these Indigenous women and girls, just as much as violence against Indigenous women and girls, and they have to be addressed concurrently. It can't be a scenario where we do a national inquiry and wait and see what happens. Every week we see another Indigenous girl go murdered or missing, and we have to stop that. That's a crisis in Canada. It's an emergency which calls for action today. And there's nothing that prevents an emergency action plan from being implemented in partnership with Indigenous peoples at the same time that a planning for a proper national inquiry happens.
Thank you.